Hi there. So today I'm going to talk about chapter 25 in the ecology textbook, which is called Global Ecology. And I'm really going to focus on nutrient cycling and global cycles of different nutrients and elements. So nutrients cycle. This is a common misconception that students think they can go someplace and they can just measure the nitrogen content in the soil and it'll tell them something about how productive a landscape might be. The problem is that nutrients cycle from one form to another. And so just measuring the nitrogen at one point doesn't tell you very much. So this is because nutrients are taken up, they're remineralized, they're excreted, cells die, eggs are laid, there are microbial processes. And so we're really talking about fluxes of nutrients, not pools. And so you can't really just measure nutrients at one moment. And you can, but it just doesn't tell you very much. The story in nutrient cycling is all about the flux, these changes from one form to another. And so something that's really also really helpful is to know which nutrients are limiting growth. So we'll talk about limiting nutrients in this lecture as well. So here's a very complicated graph of the nitrogen cycle. I'm noticing that my video window is covering some important things up. So I'm going to move it down here. What you can see are pools in boxes. And so that tells you how much of these different forms of nitrogen might be found in different locations on a global scale. What you can see is that most of the nitrogen on Earth is in the atmosphere and in benthic sediments and rocks. So a lot of nitrogen is locked up in these places and it's not available to plants. It's not available for productive ecosystems. What you can also see is that the orange arrows are human-caused changes to fluxes. So the arrows are fluxes, the boxes are pools, and the orange arrows are things that humans have influenced or are influencing. And you can see there's large numbers associated with these orange arrows. And so humans, through things like industrial fixation, and basically the creation of fertilizer, nitrogen fixation by crops, fossil fuel use, burning, animal nitrogen, all of these things are really changing the fluxes of nitrogen on Earth. And this is important because excess nitrogen is a pollutant. So excess nitrogen can cause fish kills because if you get too much nitrogen in an aquatic ecosystem, and you get a bloom of algae. The algae are great because they're making oxygen, but at night they stop photosynthesizing and they respire away all of the oxygen in the water, which basically kills fish. So the nitrogen cycle is really important. Things like fixation, denitrification, and uptake by vegetation are really important aspects. And so the forms of nitrogen are like this. There's nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, makes up 78% of our atmosphere. And it's very unavailable to most plants because of a triple bond. Then you have dissolved inorganic nitrogen, things like nitrate, ammonium, and nitrite. So these are all forms of inorganic nitrogen that tend to be found in soil, in water sources, and often can be used by plants. Nitrite can be toxic. Ammonium can also be toxic, especially when it's converted to ammonia. And then nitrous oxide is a gas. It's an important greenhouse gas, which is GHG. That's what that stands for. Then there are also dissolved organic forms of nitrogen. So anytime something falls into the water, it dissolves out things like amino acids and lipids and proteins. And so all of those things can be in dissolved form in water bodies. And plants and other organisms can access these organic forms of nitrogen. And then you have particulate organic nitrogen, which is chunks of stuff, chunks of proteins and urea. So like a salmon carcass would be dropping off little bits of particulate organic nitrogen in a stream or on the forest floor. So all of these forms of nitrogen kind of come together in the nitrogen cycle. It's actually, quite complicated. But what you can see over here at the top, we have what are called oxic processes. These processes have to occur in the presence of oxygen. So going from an organic form of nitrogen. You have some forms of bacteria and microbes that mineralize that organic nitrogen into ammonium, and then nitrification can convert ammonium into nitrate and into, oops, this is supposed to be nitrite. That's an error in the figure. And this is nitrate. Then on the bottom, you have anoxic processes. These processes have to take place in the absence of oxygen. And so you can reduce nitrate back into ammonium if you're a nitrate reducing organism. You can ferment organic nitrogen into ammonium if you're a fermenting organism. And then nitrogen gas can be fixed into organic nitrogen by nitrogen fixing bacteria. And then denitrification, again, kind of hiding under my little picture here, is a process by which we can take, microbes can take nitrate and turn it into a whole sequence of forms of nitrous oxide, N's and O's, basically, until you get it back into nitrogen gas. This is a really important process because it can take excess nitrogen in an aquatic ecosystem and convert it back into nitrogen gas, which gets that toxic, those toxic algal blooms to disappear. Here's some of the organisms that can do nitrogen fixation. So we have cyanobacteria, free-living cyanobacteria. We have cyanobacteria that live in root nodules. Here you can see a root nodule. Over here you can see root nodules. And this tiny little fern is called the azolla fern, and it has nitrogen-fixing bacteria inside of it. And then lightning. Lightning actually fixes a significant amount of nitrogen. It cracks apart the nitrogen gas molecules in the atmosphere, and they become available to plants. Here's just a picture of why denitrification is so important in freshwater ecosystems. If you have a whole lot of nitrogen pollution coming in from agricultural sources through runoff, then that can cause kind of the greening up of aquatic ecosystems. But if you add a bunch of particulate, like organic material, high detritus content. There, you can see this right here. Oh, this thing is going to be in the way no matter where I put it. You put a lot of wood and leaves and things into a stream, you can create these anoxic conditions that will allow for denitrification and actually get that nitrogen back up out of the stream, which is really great. Here's just kind of, this one sometimes helps people to see. If you want to pause the video and take a look at all of these processes, it gives kind of a cartoon view of the nitrogen cycle, which can be really nice. Okay, so it's not just fish kills that we're worried about, but nitrogen in water can cause human health problems. So the standards for nitrate and nitrite contamination are 10 milligrams per liter. And if you have higher nitrate concentrations in drinking water, then something called blue baby syndrome can actually occur, which is called methemoglobinemia. And it's when nitrate binds more strongly to the hemoglobin in a baby's blood than oxygen, and it can actually cause them to suffocate. It's a problem when people are making baby formula with water that has high nitrate concentrations, and it's quite common in agricultural areas as well. So here you can see the change in nitrogen flux over time as human populations have increased. As human populations have increased here, you can see that the total anthropogenic reactive nitrogen creation, this red line, has just skyrocketed. And that's mainly because of increases in fertilizer in the Green Revolution since 1950. So this is all fertilizer increases and a little bit of increase in nitrogen fixation by crops like soybeans and lentils and peas and things like that, and some increase in fossil fuel combustion as well. So when we're talking about nutrients and the growth of plants, all these nutrients are required for plant growth, but they're not all required in the same amounts. And sometimes plant growth can be halted because a particular nutrient is not common enough. And so it doesn't matter how many other, how much of these other nutrients you add, the plant won't grow because there's one nutrient that's limiting its growth. And so this is called Liebig's law of the minimum. And so a good analogy is a car assembly line. And so I want you to look at this list of supplies, pause the video, and figure out how many cars you can build. Okay, great. How many cars did you figure out you could build? Turns out you can only build 25 cars, right? Because each car needs 2 axles. And since there's only 50 axles, you can only build 25 cars. It doesn't matter that you have 400 wheels or 1,000 steering wheels, you're limited by the number of axles. And so this is a good analogy for a limiting nutrient. So you might be limited by nitrogen, you might be limited by phosphorus, you might be limited by molybdenum or some other micronutrient. Okay, so take a 10-minute break and pause the video.